The health of the Chesapeake Bay isn't what it used to be, as many people already know. The main problems that many are familiar with are sediment runoff, which covers seagrasses and oysters, degrading their habitat. These grasses provide a home for small fish and a place for crabs to spawn their young. You may also know that winds and tide currents often resuspend the sediment, which reduces the sunlight to the grasses, preventing them from growing. The other main issue with this runoff is fertilizers and chicken manure, which are picked up by stormwater after being used for agricultural purposes. These excess nutrients flow over impervious surfaces while making their way to the bay, where algae blooms will occur, leading to dead zones. While most people have heard of these problems, we base our opinions on the health of the bay on how visually clear the water appears from the dock or beach. And the question that I aim to answer is the water clarity an effective indicator on the health of the bay? And what are the complex factors that influence the bay's negative water clarity? After researching this, I learned about the phytoplankton that live in the bay and their impact on the water clarity. Phytoplankton are microscopic organisms that live on the surface of the water, feeding on sunlight as well as dissolved nutrients. Most of these nutrients come from runoff, which means the more nutrients that enter the bay, the more phytoplankton there will be. Temperature also impacts the water clarity, because phytoplankton don't grow in cold water, which means that in the winter the clarity of the water is much clearer than in the summer months. Now transitioning into measuring the water clarity, it's quite simple. I used a Secchi disc to measure the water clarity of my local pier. To use the disc, you start by lowering it into the water until I couldn't see it anymore, and then at this point I would pull it up slightly until it's barely visible. Now this length of rope connecting the disc to the surface of the water represents the water clarity in that area. What I found from these measurements was that after a rainfall, the water clarity would decrease around 20 to 30 inches, which means the disc would go out of sight much sooner. This is due to the sediment and nutrients that run off into the water when it rains, degrading the clarity. It's also worth mentioning that on days with strong winds, the clarity measurements were much worse than on days with little to no wind. This is because the wind resuspends the sediment on the bottom, which clouds the water above it. Overall, the water clarity significantly decreased after it rained, which is really unfortunate because it shows the effect of runoff that we as a community have on the bay. There are many ways that you can help, with the first being measuring the water clarity near you before and after a rainfall. You can be able to visualize the effect that your neighborhood is having on the water clarity in your area. Next, eliminating the use of fertilizers and lawn killers on your yard will make sure that the runoff stormwater is unable to pick up these excess nutrients and then transport them to the bay. Lastly, reducing soil erosion on your property by planting trees or spreading mulch over bare ground is another way to help reduce the amount of sediment runoff that gets picked up off of your home. Overall, the clarity of the water is definitely the easiest way to determine the health of the bay, but there are many other important factors in the water which causes it to look a certain way. While this is true, it's also important to understand the negative effects that your activities can have on the bay in order to fix them and hopefully increase the health of the bay.